The wind howled like a wounded beast across the Wyoming territory, carrying with it the scent of rain and desperation on that fateful evening in 1876 when Josiah Brown first heard the feeble knocking at his cabin door. She collapsed in front of a cowboy's cabin with nothing but a baby. The knock came again, weaker this time, barely audible above the gathering storm. Tanner Blackwood set down his coffee mug and reached for the rifle that hung above the stone fireplace, a habit born from years of solitary living in frontier country where unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "Who's there?" he called out, his deep voice carrying the rough edge of a man unaccustomed to company. No answer came, just the persistent howl of the wind. Cautiously, Tanner approached the door, rifle in hand, and pulled it open. The sight that greeted him would forever be etched in his memory. A young woman, her dress torn and muddied, clutching a bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. Her face was ashen, framed by matted auburn hair, and her eyes, striking even in their exhaustion, met his for just a moment before they rolled back as she collapsed at his threshold. "Good Lord," he muttered, setting aside his rifle and kneeling beside her. The bundle in her arms whimpered, and Tanner carefully pulled back the edge of the blanket to reveal the tiny, scrunched face of an infant, no more than a few weeks old. The baby's cries grew stronger as the cold air touched its face. With careful movements that belied his large, calloused hands, Tanner gathered the unconscious woman into his arms and carried her inside, the baby still clutched to her chest. His bachelor's cabin was sparse but warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the scent of coffee and beans hanging in the air. He laid her on his bed, the only one in the cabin, and gently pried the infant from her protective embrace. The child was a girl, her wisps of hair the same rich auburn as her mother's, her tiny fingers curling reflexively around his thumb when he touched her palm. "Don't you worry, little one," he whispered, wrapping her in a clean blanket he found in his chest of drawers. "Your ma's going to be just fine." But looking at the woman's pale face and the dark circles beneath her eyes, Tanner wasn't so certain. He dampened a cloth and wiped the dirt from her face, noticing the fresh bruise blooming on her left cheekbone and the dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Someone had hurt her, and recently. The baby began to cry in earnest, a hungry, desperate sound that tugged at something deep within Tanner's chest. He knew nothing about caring for infants, having lived alone since he'd come west 5 years ago, fleeing memories of the war and a family name tarnished by his father's crimes back in Boston. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked the wailing child. The woman showed no signs of waking, her breathing shallow but steady. Tanner paced the cabin, bouncing the baby awkwardly in his arms. Outside, the storm had broken in full force, rain lashing against the windows and lightning illuminating the desolate landscape in harsh, white flashes. No one would be traveling in this weather, not even Doc Wilson from the settlement 10 miles to the east. The baby's cries grew more insistent, and Tanner felt a rising panic. He had milk from his cow in the spring house, but would that do for a baby? He had no bottles, no way to feed her properly. In desperation, he dipped a clean handkerchief in the milk and offered it to the infant. To his relief, she began to suck on the cloth, her cries subsiding to occasional whimpers. "That's it," he encouraged softly. "Just a little something to tide you over until your ma wakes up." As the night wore on, Tanner kept vigil. He bathed the woman's face with cool water, checked her pulse, and tried to make the baby comfortable. Every so often, he would dip the handkerchief in fresh milk, allowing the infant to suckle what she could. It wasn't much, but it seemed to soothe her. In the quiet hours past midnight, as the storm began to abate and the baby finally slept in a makeshift bed he'd fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets, Tanner was struck by a thought. This child, this innocent life, had nowhere proper to sleep, and her mother, whoever she was, had clearly gone through hell to bring her here. He glanced at his woodworking tools in the corner of the cabin. Before settling into ranching, he'd been a carpenter's apprentice in his youth, and though he rarely used those skills now except for practical repairs, they hadn't abandoned him. With newfound purpose, Tanner gathered his tools and some pine boards he'd been saving for mending the corral fence. By the light of the oil lamp, he began to measure and saw, working quietly so as not to disturb his unexpected guests. His hands remembered the way of it, the grain of the wood, the precise angles of the cuts, the smooth rhythm of the plane against rough edges. As the night deepened and then began to give way to the first hints of dawn, a cradle took shape beneath his hands. Nothing fancy, but sturdy and sound, with gently curved sides and rockers that would sway smoothly on the plank floor. Just as the first rays of sunlight pierced the eastern sky, Tanner put the finishing touches on his creation. He stood back, regarding his work with critical eyes, then nodded, satisfied. It would do. He was sanding the edges to ensure no splinters would harm the delicate infant when he heard a soft gasp from the bed. The woman was awake, her eyes a startling shade of green wide with fear as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. "My baby," she whispered, her voice cracked and desperate. "Where's my baby?" "She's right here," Tanner said gently, moving to retrieve the sleeping infant from her drawer bed. "She's fine. I gave her some cow's milk, didn't have much else. Hope that was all right." Relief flooded the woman's face as he placed the child in her arms. She clutched the baby to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for helping us." "Name's Tanner Blackwood," he offered, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance after the night's work. "And you are?" She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if assessing her chances of escape. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Julia Calloway. And this is Felicity." "Miss Calloway," Tanner acknowledged with a nod. "You and little Felicity have had a rough time of it, I reckon. You're safe here, if that's what you're worried about." Her eyes darted around the cabin again, taking in the simple furnishings. The rifle returned to its place above the fireplace, and finally, the freshly made cradle standing by the bed. "Did you make that?" she asked, incredulous. Tanner felt a warmth creep up his neck. Figured the little one could use something better than a drawer to sleep in. "It's nothing fancy, but it'll serve." Julia's eyes welled with fresh tears. "No one's ever." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Tanner," he corrected. "Just Tanner is fine." Outside, the new day was breaking clear and bright after the storm, sunlight spilling across the prairie in golden waves. Inside the cabin, something else was dawning, something neither Tanner nor Julia could name yet, but both could feel taking root in the quiet space between them. As Felicity began to fuss, awakening to hunger once more, Tanner moved to prepare breakfast, his mind already turning to what other comforts he might fashion for the woman and child who had appeared so unexpectedly at his door. And though he didn't know it yet, this morning marked the beginning of a journey that would change the course of all their lives. The next few days established a tentative routine in Tanner's formerly solitary cabin. Julia remained weak, though she insisted on helping with what tasks she could manage while caring for Felicity. Tanner found himself watching them, often the tender way Julia stroked her daughter's cheek, the soft lullabies she sang when she thought he wasn't listening. On the third morning, as Julia sat in the chair by the fire nursing Felicity, she finally began to speak of what had brought her to his doorstep. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Thomas Calloway. He was a good man, worked as a clerk for the railroad in Cheyenne. We had a little house, not much, but it was ours." She paused, swallowing hard. "When he died, pneumonia took him. In just a week, his brother Silas showed up claiming Thomas had owed him money. Said the house was rightfully his now." Tanner remained silent, sensing she needed to tell her story without interruption. "I was already with child by then." "Silas?" Julia's voice faltered. "Silas said he'd forgive the debt if I married him instead. When I refused, he turned cruel. Said no one would believe a pregnant widow's word against his. He had friends in town, influence. He made sure I couldn't find work, couldn't rent a room anywhere." Her fingers gently stroked Felicity's hair as the baby nursed. "After Felicity was born, he came to the boarding house where I'd been staying. Said he'd have me declared unfit, take my baby from me." Julia's eyes met Tanner's, fierce despite the fear behind them. "I left that night. Took what little money I had saved and bought passage on a wagon train heading west. But the family I was traveling with, they didn't want the trouble when Silas's men caught up to us outside Laramie." "They left you behind?" Tanner asked, unable to keep the anger from his voice. Julia nodded. "Said they couldn't risk their own children for mine. One of the women slipped me some food, and pointed me toward the next settlement. Said I might find help there. A bitter smile crossed her face. I walked for 2 days before the storm hit. Your cabin was the first I'd seen. Tanner's hands clenched involuntarily. The thought of this woman trudging across the wilderness with an infant in her arms, frightened and alone, stirred something protective in him that he hadn't felt in years. He won't find you here, Tanner said firmly. And if he does, he'll have me to reckon with. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Julia's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she offered him the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. You're a good man, Tanner Blackwood. He ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise. Just doing what anyone would. No, she said softly. Not just anyone. Later that day, Tanner rode to the settlement to fetch supplies. The trading post was run by an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who had known Tanner since he'd first claimed his land 5 years prior. Well now, this is unusual, Mrs. Henderson remarked as Tanner loaded his purchases onto the counter. Fabric? Thread? And is that a baby bottle? Her eyes twinkled with undisguised curiosity. Something you want to tell us, Tanner? Tanner cleared his throat. Got visitors. A woman and her baby. They'll be staying with me a while. Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow. A woman, you say? And here we thought you were determined to live out your days as a hermit. It's not like that, Tanner protested, though he could feel the heat rising in his face. She's in trouble. Needed help. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. Of course. And you're doing the Christian thing, taking them in. She began wrapping his purchases in brown paper. Does this lady friend have a name? Julia Calloway, Tanner answered, then immediately regretted it when he saw the gleam in Mrs. Henderson's eye. The news would be all over the settlement by sundown. And the baby? Felicity. She's just a few weeks old. Mrs. Henderson added a small package to his pile. Honey cakes, she explained. My mother swore by them for helping nursing mothers keep up their strength. Tanner accepted the gift with a nod of thanks, paid for his purchases, and headed for the door. He was nearly outside when Mrs. Henderson called after him. Tanner, you be careful. A woman alone with a baby, she might be running from something. Or someone. I know, he replied grimly. That's why she's staying with me. The ride back to his cabin gave Tanner time to think. Julia couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, she would need to establish a life for herself and Felicity somewhere. The question was whether that somewhere could be here, in this territory where he'd made his home. The thought of them leaving, of returning to his solitary existence, left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. In just a few days, the sound of Julia's soft voice and Felicity's coos had transformed his cabin from a mere shelter to something that felt like a home. When he arrived back at the cabin, the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Julia had hung his spare shirts and trousers on a line outside to dry in the sunshine. She stood by the clothesline, Felicity bundled against her chest, and she was singing a sweet, clear melody that carried across the yard. She hadn't noticed him yet, and for a moment, Tanner allowed himself to imagine this was his family, his home complete with a wife and child waiting for his return. The fantasy was so vivid, so achingly desirable, that it startled him. He'd never thought to marry, not after what his father had done to his mother, the betrayals, the cruelty disguised as love. Tanner had sworn he'd never risk putting a woman through such pain. Yet watching Julia, seeing the strength in her despite all she'd endured, he wondered if perhaps he'd been wrong to close his heart so completely. Julia turned then and saw him. Her song faltered, but her smile bloomed, genuine and warm. You're back, she said, walking toward him as he dismounted. I hope you don't mind, but I found some soap and washed your clothes. They were, she paused, diplomatically. Filthy, Tanner supplied with a chuckle. Bachelor living doesn't lend itself to regular laundry days. Well, they're clean now. She peered at the packages strapped to his horse. You brought supplies? Thought you and Felicity might need some things. He began unloading the parcels. Got fabric for baby clothes, a proper bottle, some medicines from the general store. Julia's eyes widened as he continued to unpack. Tanner, this is too much. I can't possibly repay you for all this. Not asking for repayment, he said gruffly. Just want you both comfortable while you're here. Her expression softened. How long do you think that might be? The question hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to address. As long as you need, Tanner finally answered. My home is yours for as long as you want it. Something flickered in Julia's eyes, relief, gratitude, and perhaps something deeper that Tanner dared not name. She reached out impulsively and squeezed his hand. Thank you for everything. Her touch sent a jolt through him, warm and electric, and Tanner found himself reluctant to let her go. But Felicity chose that moment to let out a hungry cry, breaking the spell. I should feed her, Julia said, her cheeks flushing slightly as she withdrew her hand. And then perhaps I could prepare supper? To thank you properly? Tanner nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as she carried Felicity inside, the baby's cries subsiding as the door closed behind them. With a deep breath, Tanner turned to tend to his horse, trying to ignore the voice in his head that whispered this arrangement, this make-believe family, was something he could grow to need more than air itself. The days began to blend one into another, each filled with small domesticities that Tanner had never imagined would be part of his life. Julia proved to be an excellent cook, transforming his simple provisions into meals that reminded him of his mother's kitchen long ago. In return, Tanner taught her about the workings of the ranch, his small herd of cattle, the vegetable garden he maintained, the orchard he'd planted his first year that was just beginning to bear fruit. As Julia regained her strength, she took on more responsibilities around the cabin. She sewed new clothes for Felicity from the fabric Tanner had purchased, mended his shirts, and kept the cabin cleaner than it had ever been during his bachelor days. Felicity grew stronger by the day as well. Her cries became more vigorous, her eyes the same startling green as her mother's, more alert and curious. Tanner found himself spending evening hours with the infant in his arms, telling her stories about the stars visible through the cabin window while Julia sewed by lamplight. She likes your voice, Julia remarked one evening, smiling as Felicity cooed in response to Tanner's deep rumble. It soothes her. My mother used to say I had a voice meant for calming horses and babies, Tanner replied, gently rocking the cradle he'd built with his foot as Felicity drifted toward sleep. Never thought I'd get to test the latter. You never wanted children of your own? Julia asked, her needle pausing in its work. Tanner hesitated. Never thought I'd have the chance. Or the right. The right. Julia set aside her sewing. What do you mean? Tanner stared into the fire, the memories he'd kept at bay for so long suddenly pressing close. My father was not a good man, he finally said. He had a way with words, could charm anyone into believing whatever he wanted. My mother fell for it, married him thinking he was her dream come true. His jaw tightened. 10 years and 3 children later, she realized the dream was a nightmare. He gambled, drank, disappeared for weeks only to return full of promises he never kept. When he was home, his temper. Tanner trailed off. You were afraid you'd be like him, Julia supplied softly. Tanner nodded. The war came at the right time for me. Gave me a reason to leave Boston, to prove I was nothing like him. After, I couldn't go back. Came west instead. Figured I'd live out my days alone rather than risk bringing that same pain to a woman and children. Julia was silent for a long moment. Then she rose from her chair and crossed to where Tanner sat, kneeling beside him. My father was a cruel man too, she said quietly. He ruled our home with an iron fist and a leather strap. My mother lived in fear of his moods until the day she died. She placed a gentle hand on Tanner's arm. But my Thomas, he was nothing like my father. He was kind and gentle, even when life was hard. We choose who we become, Tanner. We're not bound by our father's sins. Her words found a place in his heart that had been closed for too long, and Tanner felt something shift within him, a loosening of a knot he hadn't known was there. Your Thomas was a lucky man, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Julia's eyes glistened in the firelight. And I was a lucky woman, for the time we had. She glanced at Felicity, now sleeping peacefully in her cradle. He would have adored her. He would have been proud of you, Tanner said. For how brave you've been, how strong. Julia looked up at him, something vulnerable and questioning in her gaze. For a breathless moment, Tanner thought she might lean closer, that he might feel the softness of her lips against his. But Felicity stirred in her sleep, breaking the spell, and Julia rose quickly to her feet. It's late, she said, her voice slightly unsteady. I should get some rest. Tanner nodded, both relieved and disappointed. Good night, Julia. Good night, Tanner. She paused at the doorway to the small alcove he'd fashioned for her privacy. "Thank you for telling me about your father. For trusting me with that." After she'd gone, Tanner remained by the fire, watching the flames dance and thinking about choices, about fathers and sons, about the unexpected second chance that had quite literally collapsed on his doorstep. The weeks passed, summer ripening toward autumn. Julia and Felicity became fixtures in Tanner's life, their presence transforming his isolated existence into something rich and full. They established routines breakfast together as dawn broke over the plains, Tanner working the ranch while Julia tended to household matters and Felicity, evenings spent in comfortable conversation as the day's heat dissipated. Tanner found himself looking forward to those evening hours most of all. Julia's gentle humor, her insightful observations, the way she listened when he spoke, as if his words truly mattered. More than once, he caught himself watching her as she moved about the cabin, her auburn hair gleaming in the lamplight, and had to forcibly turn his thoughts elsewhere. She was a widow still mourning her husband, he reminded himself. She needed his protection, not his growing affection. And yet, sometimes he would catch her watching him too, a soft expression in her eyes that made his heart quicken with possibility. One afternoon in late August, Tanner returned from checking fence lines to find a wagon pulled up outside his cabin. His heart lurched with alarm. Had Silas Calloway found them? But as he rode closer, he recognized the Hendersons' carriage. Mrs. Henderson was seated at his table, chattering away while Julia served coffee. Felicity lay on a blanket nearby, kicking her legs and cooing at the colorful mobile Tanner had carved and hung above her cradle. "There he is now," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed as Tanner entered. "We were just talking about you, young man." "Nothing too terrible, I hope," Tanner replied, removing his hat and nodding a greeting to Julia, whose cheeks seemed unusually flushed. "Quite the opposite," Mrs. Henderson assured him. "I was just telling Julia what a fine, upstanding member of our community you've become, though I was expressing my surprise that you've kept your guests such a secret. It took my husband mentioning your purchases for me to connect the dots." Julia gave Tanner an apologetic look. Mrs. Henderson brought some preserves and fresh bread. "And news from town?" "Oh yes," the older woman nodded eagerly. "The Harvest Festival is next month, and I was just insisting that you both must attend. It's the social event of the season, and it would do you good to introduce Julia to everyone properly." Tanner exchanged a glance with Julia, reading the uncertainty in her eyes. They had spoken little of venturing beyond the safety of the ranch, both aware that the further word spread of her presence, the greater the risk that Silas might hear of it. "We'll consider it," Tanner said diplomatically, though Julia is still regaining her strength after her journey. Mrs. Henderson waved away his concern. "Nonsense. The girl looks the picture of health now, thanks to your care." She gave Julia an assessing look. "And what a picture she is. No wonder you've been keeping her all to yourself, Tanner Blackwood." Julia's blush deepened, and Tanner felt his own face growing warm. "It's not like that, Mrs. Henderson," Julia protested gently. "Tanner has been kind enough to offer shelter to Felicity and me while I decide where we'll settle." Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Of course, dear. And there's certainly no finer place to settle than right here, wouldn't you agree?" She didn't wait for an answer before continuing. "Now, about your attire for the festival. I couldn't help but notice you're making do with very simple dresses. I have some lovely fabrics that my daughter sent from Chicago that would suit your coloring beautifully." "That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly," Julia began. "I insist," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Consider it a welcome gift. Tanner can bring you into town next week to choose the patterns." After another half hour of cheerful but relentless conversation, Mrs. Henderson finally took her leave, extracting promises from both Tanner and Julia that they would at least make an appearance at the Harvest Festival. As her carriage disappeared down the road, Julia turned to Tanner with a worried expression. "I'm sorry. I should have found a way to discourage her visit." Tanner shook his head. "No one discourages Martha Henderson when she's set on something. Besides, it might be good for you to meet some of the other families. The people here are good folk, loyal to their neighbors. But what if word reaches Silas?" Julia's voice held a tremor of fear. "If he learns I'm here." Tanner stepped closer, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Then we'll deal with it together." "I meant what I said, Julia. He won't take Felicity from you. Not while I'm breathing. Julia looked up at him, vulnerability and something deeper shining in her eyes. Why do you care so much? About us, I mean. You owe us nothing. Tanner struggled to find words for the feelings that had grown in him over these weeks. At first, it was just the right thing to do. But now, he paused, gathering his courage. Now I can't imagine this place without you in it. Without Felicity's cries waking me at dawn, without your voice, your laugh. You've made this cabin a home, Julia. Her lips parted in surprise, and for a moment, Tanner feared he'd said too much. But then she reached up, placing her palm against his cheek, her touch feather-light. You've given us so much more than shelter, she whispered. You've given us hope, a chance to start again. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Tanner found himself leaning toward her, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. Felicity chose that moment to let out a demanding wail, shattering the tension. Julia stepped back, her hand falling away as she turned to attend to her daughter. Tanner released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wasn't sure if he should be grateful for the interruption or curse it. But watching Julia lift Felicity, murmuring soothing words as she cradled her daughter close, Tanner knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, Silas Calloway, the Harvest Festival, or simply the changing seasons, he would do everything in his power to keep them both safe, and, if they would let him, to make them his family in truth. The day of the Harvest Festival arrived with the crisp clarity that marked early autumn in the Wyoming Territory. Tanner rose before dawn, as was his habit, but found himself taking unusual care with his appearance. He shaved meticulously, donned his best shirt, a dark blue cotton that Julia had pressed the night before, and even polished his boots until they gleamed. Julia emerged from her alcove just as he was finishing his coffee, and the sight of her stole the breath from his lungs. Mrs. Henderson had been true to her word, providing fabric for a new dress in a rich green that matched Julia's eyes. Julia had worked on it in the evenings after Felicity was asleep, refusing to let Tanner see until it was complete. The result was stunning. The dress was modest but beautifully fitted, emphasizing the graceful curve of her waist and the elegant line of her neck. She had pinned her hair up, with a few auburn curls escaping to frame her face. "Will I do?" she asked, a hint of shyness in her smile as she turned slowly. "You're beautiful," Tanner said simply, the words falling from his lips before he could consider them. A blush rose in Julia's cheeks. "Thank you. It feels strange to dress up after so long." She smoothed her hands over the skirt. "Mrs. Henderson insisted the color suits me." She was right, Tanner agreed. He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward in his own skin. "Is Felicity ready?" "Yes. I fed her and changed her into the new gown I made." Julia fetched the baby from her cradle, now dressed in a white dress with green ribbons that matched her mother's. "I'm nervous about taking her amongst so many strangers." "We don't have to go," Tanner offered. "We could stay here, have our own celebration." Julia shook her head. "No, you were right before. I can't hide forever, and the people here have been nothing but kind." She adjusted Felicity in her arms. "Besides, I think we could all use a day of music and merriment, don't you?" The journey into town was peaceful, the wagon rolling smoothly over the hard-packed dirt road. Julia sat beside Tanner on the bench seat, Felicity securely nestled in a basket between them. The baby had grown considerably in the weeks since their arrival, her features becoming more defined, her personality emerging in gurgling laughs and indignant cries. As they approached the settlement, they could hear fiddle music floating on the breeze. The town square had been transformed with bunting and garlands of autumn leaves. Tables laden with food lined one side, while a wooden platform had been erected for dancing. Children darted between groups of chatting adults, their excited voices adding to the festive atmosphere. Tanner felt a surge of protectiveness as he helped Julia down from the wagon, conscious of the curious glances directed their way. He had rarely attended community gatherings before, preferring the solitude of his ranch, and his arrival with a beautiful woman and infant was certain to cause a stir. Mrs. Henderson spotted them immediately and bustled over, her husband following at a more sedate pace. "You came, and don't you both look wonderful?" She beamed at Julia. "That color is perfect, just as I said. And little Felicity, my goodness, she's grown." More introductions followed as Mrs. Henderson insisted on presenting Julia to what seemed like every family in the territory. Tanner stayed close, his hand occasionally coming to rest at the small of Julia's back as they navigated the crowd. He couldn't help but notice how she leaned into his touch, as if drawing strength from his presence. "Tanner Blackwood, as I live and breathe," a familiar voice called out. "Never thought I'd see you at one of these shindigs." Tanner turned to find Sheriff Matthew Larson approaching, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. They had served together briefly during the war before Larson headed west. "Matt," Tanner greeted him with a handshake. "Good to see you." The sheriff's eyes moved to Julia, curiosity evident in his expression. "And who might this lovely lady be?" "Julia Calloway," Tanner introduced her. "And her daughter, Felicity." "Julia, this is Sheriff Larson." "Madam," Larson tipped his hat respectfully. "Welcome to our little community. I trust Tanner's been treating you well." "More than well," Julia replied warmly. "He's been a godsend to Felicity and me." Larson raised an eyebrow at Tanner. "Is that so? Well, wonders never cease." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you might be in a difficult situation, madam. If there's any official help you need, my door's always open." Julia tensed slightly, but managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate that." As the day progressed, Tanner found himself relaxing despite his initial reservations. Julia was welcomed warmly by the townsfolk, many of the women cooing over Felicity and offering advice about teething and sleeping patterns. Several of the ranchers' wives exchanged knowing glances when they saw the way Tanner hovered near Julia, but their comments were good-natured. After the communal feast, the dancing began in earnest. Tanner hung back, never having been much for dancing, but he enjoyed watching Julia's face as she took in the lively scene. "Would you care to dance, Mrs. Calloway?" a voice asked, and Tanner turned to see young William Parker, the blacksmith's son, extending a hand toward Julia. Julia glanced at Tanner, a question in her eyes. He nodded, trying to ignore the irrational pang of jealousy as she handed Felicity to him and allowed William to lead her to the dance floor. "She's quite something," Sheriff Larson commented, appearing at Tanner's side as he bounced Felicity gently in his arms. "Not often we see you so taken with anyone." "I'm not," Tanner began, then stopped, knowing the denial would sound hollow. "She needed help. I provided it." Larson's expression was skeptical. "Uh-huh. And the way you look at her like she hung the moon is just neighborly concern." Tanner sighed. "It's complicated, Matt. Usually is, with the good ones." Larson's tone turned serious. "Listen, Tanner. I've been making inquiries about this Silas Calloway character she's running from. He's real, and he's bad news. Railroad man with connections all the way to Chicago. Been asking questions in towns west of Cheyenne about a woman with an infant." Tanner's grip on Felicity tightened. "How close?" "Last I heard, he had men in Laramie." Larson's eyes were grave. "If he's determined, it won't take him long to follow her trail here." The music seemed to fade as Tanner processed this information. On the dance floor, Julia was laughing as William twirled her, her green dress swirling around her ankles, her face alight with momentary joy. "What do you suggest?" Tanner asked, his voice low. "Depends on what you're willing to do," Larson replied. "If she's just a temporary guest, might be best to help her move on, further west perhaps. But if she's more than that..." He gave Tanner a meaningful look. "A woman has more protection under the law as a wife than as a widow." Before Tanner could respond, the music ended and Julia was making her way back to them, her cheeks flushed from dancing. "That was wonderful," she said, breathless. "I haven't danced since," she broke off, noticing the serious expressions on their faces. "Is everything all right?" "Just sheriff business," Larson said smoothly. "Nothing to worry about today." He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Calloway, it's been a pleasure. I hope we'll see more of you in town." As Larson moved away, Julia took Felicity from Tanner's arms. "You look very serious. Are you sure everything's all right?" Tanner forced a smile. "Everything's fine. Are you enjoying yourself?" "Very much," she admitted. "Everyone has been so welcoming. Mrs. Peterson even offered me work doing mending and alterations if I wanted it. Is that something you'd be interested in?" Tanner asked carefully. Julia hesitated. "Perhaps. It would be good to earn my own way, to contribute something for all you've done for us." The fiddle struck up another tune, slower this time. Couples moved onto the dance floor, holding each other close. "Would you dance with me?" Tanner asked suddenly, surprising himself. Julia's eyes widened slightly. "But Felicity, I'll take her." Mrs. Henderson appeared, as if summoned by the mention of the baby. "You two young people enjoy yourselves. It's about time." Tanner Blackwood remembered how to have some fun. Before Julia could protest, Mrs. Henderson had whisked Felicity away, cooing to the infant as she went. Tanner offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Julia placed her fingers in his. He led her to the edge of the dance floor, suddenly aware of his own awkwardness. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer," he admitted. Julia smiled up at him. "Neither am I, really. Thomas had 2 left feet, so we rarely danced except at our wedding." The mention of her late husband might have created distance between them, but instead, it felt like a door opening, an invitation to step further into her past, to know her more completely. Tanner placed his hand respectfully at her waist, holding her other hand in his as they began to move to the gentle rhythm of the music. At first, they were stiff, careful not to step on each other's feet or move too close. But as the music continued, something shifted. Julia relaxed into his arms, and Tanner found himself drawing her closer, their bodies swaying in perfect harmony. "This is nice," Julia murmured, looking up at him with an expression that made his heart stutter in his chest. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rougher than he intended. "It is." They danced in silence for a while, the music wrapping around them like a cocoon, separating them from the curious glances and knowing smiles of the townsfolk. "Julia," Tanner finally said, gathering his courage, "there's something I need to tell you." She must have heard the seriousness in his tone, for her expression grew concerned. "What is it?" "Larson's been making inquiries. About Silas." He felt her stiffen in his arms. "He's in Laramie, asking questions. It's possible he might find his way here." Fear flashed across Julia's face. "Then we should leave. Tonight. I won't put you in danger, Tanner." "No," he said firmly. "Running isn't the answer. Not anymore." He took a deep breath. "There's another option. One that would give you legal protection from Silas's claims." Julia's brow furrowed in confusion, then cleared as understanding dawned. "Tanner, are you suggesting marriage?" he confirmed, the word hanging between them. "If you were my wife, Silas would have no claim on you or Felicity. No court would side with him against a legal husband." Julia had stopped dancing, though she remained in the circle of his arms. "You would do that? Marry me just to protect us from Silas?" Tanner's heart hammered in his chest. This was the moment to be honest, to tell her that what had begun as simple charity had grown into something far deeper, far more profound. "Not just for that," he said quietly. "These past weeks with you and Felicity, they've been the happiest of my life. I know it's soon, and I know you're still grieving Thomas. I'm not asking you to love me the way you loved him, but I think we could build a good life together, the 3 of us. If you wanted to." Julia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Tanner, you don't have to answer now," he rushed to add. "Just think about it. Please." Before she could respond, a commotion broke out near the entrance to the square. Voices were raised in alarm, and Tanner instinctively pulled Julia closer, shielding her as he turned to see what was happening. 3 men on horseback had ridden into the festival grounds, dust-covered and grim-faced. The one in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, with a meticulously trimmed beard and cold eyes that scanned the crowd with predatory focus. "Silas," Julia whispered, her face draining of color. "How did he find us so quickly?" Tanner's mind raced. "Where's Felicity?" "With Mrs. Henderson. Over by the food tables." "Go to her," Tanner instructed. "Stay out of sight if you can. I'll deal with this." Julia clutched his arm. "Tanner, he's dangerous. He won't listen to reason." "I'm not planning to reason with him." Tanner's voice was hard. "Go, Julia. Now." As Julia slipped away through the crowd, Tanner made his way toward Sheriff Larson, who was already approaching the newcomers with a hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Gentlemen," Larson called out, "you seem to be in an awful hurry. Something I can help you with." The leader, Silas Calloway, Tanner presumed dismounted with fluid grace. Despite the dust of travel, his clothes were expensive, his manner imperious. "I'm looking for a woman," Silas announced, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "My sister-in-law, Julia Calloway." She disappeared from Cheyenne with my niece. The child is unwell and needs proper medical care. His concerned expression might have been convincing to someone who didn't know better. That's so, Larson replied, his tone neutral. And you tracked her all the way here? We've been following reports of a woman with an infant traveling west. Silas produced a folded paper from his coat. I have documents from a judge in Cheyenne granting me temporary guardianship of the child, given the mother's unstable condition. Tanner felt rage building in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm as he moved to stand beside Larson. What kind of unstable condition are we talking about? Larson asked, making no move to take the proffered document. Silas's expression hardened slightly. My brother's death affected her deeply. She's been suffering delusions, making irrational decisions. Fleeing with an infant across dangerous territory is hardly the action of a sound mind. Wouldn't you agree? Murmurs spread through the crowd. Tanner stepped forward. I'm Tanner Blackwood, he said, his voice steady despite the fury coursing through him. Julia and Felicity have been staying at my ranch for the past 2 months. I can assure you, sir, that Mrs. Calloway is of perfectly sound mind, and her daughter is thriving under her care. Silas's cold eyes fixed on Tanner, assessing. You've been harboring my family, Mr. Blackwood? I'm curious as to why a strange man would take such an interest in a widow and her child. Not strange to us, Mrs. Peterson called out from the crowd. Tanner's one of our own, and we look after our neighbors in these parts. Other voices joined in agreement, and Tanner felt a surge of gratitude for the community he'd kept at arm's length for so long. Be that as it may, Silas continued smoothly. I have a legal right to ensure my niece's welfare. If Julia is here, I would like to speak with her. That won't be necessary, came Julia's voice, clear and strong. Tanner turned to see her walking toward them, head held high, Felicity secure in her arms. Mrs. Henderson followed close behind, along with several other women from the settlement, their expressions protective. Silas's face twisted in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Julia, you've led us on quite a chase. I left to protect my daughter from you, Julia replied, her voice unwavering despite the fear Tanner knew she must be feeling. I won't let you take her from me. You're not well, Julia, Silas said, his tone patronizing. These good people don't know what you were like in Cheyenne, the hysteria, the wild accusations. Thomas would want his daughter raised properly, not dragged around the wilderness by a woman barely able to care for herself. That's a lie, Julia said firmly. Thomas would never have wanted Felicity raised by you. He knew what kind of man you are. Silas's face darkened. Careful, Julia. You're only proving my point about your mental state. He turned to Sheriff Larson. I have the legal documents, Sheriff. Will you uphold the law, or must I seek assistance elsewhere? Larson studied the papers Silas thrust toward him, his expression unreadable. The crowd had gone silent, tension thick in the air. These papers are from Wyoming territory, Larson finally said. They appear to be in order. However, he held up a hand as Silas began to smile triumphantly. I have some concerns about their validity given Mrs. Calloway's testimony. You're choosing to believe the word of a delusional woman over a court document. Silas's voice rose in indignation. I'm choosing to investigate thoroughly before separating a mother from her child, Larson corrected firmly. We do things differently out here, Mr. Calloway. We take our time, make sure justice is truly served. Silas's composure slipped, anger flashing in his eyes. This is absurd. I demand. You're in no position to demand anything, Tanner interrupted, stepping closer to Julia and placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Sheriff, there's something else you should know. Larson raised an eyebrow. What's that? Tanner looked down at Julia, a question in his eyes. She met his gaze, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a decision. Julia and I are to be married, Tanner announced, his voice carrying across the square. Tomorrow, in fact. We've been planning it for weeks. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson clasped her hands in delight, while Sheriff Larson's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Is this true, Mrs. Calloway? Larson asked. Julia's eyes never left Tanner's as she answered. Yes, Tanner has asked me to be his wife, and I've accepted. This is preposterous, Silas sputtered. A hasty marriage won't change the fact that, actually, it changes quite a lot, Larson interrupted. As Mrs. Blackwood, Julia would have her husband's protection under the law. Any guardianship claims would need to be filed against both of them, and I suspect a local judge would look rather differently at a child being raised by a married couple on an established ranch versus your claims from Cheyenne. Silas's face contorted with rage. This is some kind of trick. They're not really engaged. They're just saying that to thwart justice. Looks real enough to me, Mrs. Henderson chimed in. Anyone with eyes can see these two are sweet on each other. Have been since she arrived. Murmurs of agreement rose from the townsfolk. Tanner felt Julia's hand slip into his, her fingers warm and sure. If you don't believe us, Tanner said, addressing Silas directly, you're welcome to attend the ceremony tomorrow. Reverend Wilson can officiate. Isn't that right, Reverend? The elderly minister stepped forward from the crowd, nodding solemnly. I'd be honored to join you two in holy matrimony. Say, noon tomorrow at the church. Perfect, Tanner agreed, never taking his eyes from Silas. Silas looked from Tanner to Julia, his calculating gaze taking in their clasped hands, the protective stance of the townsfolk around them. Finally, he turned to his companions. We'll be staying in town tonight, he announced. I'm interested to see this wedding. The way he said the word made it clear he still had doubts. As Silas and his men moved off toward the hotel, escorted by Sheriff Larson, the tension in the square gradually dissipated. The music tentatively resumed, though conversations remained hushed and speculative. Tanner led Julia away from the curious eyes, finding a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree at the edge of the square. Felicity had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. I'm sorry, Tanner said quietly. I shouldn't have announced it like that, without asking you properly. But I couldn't see another way to protect you both. Julia looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Did you mean what you said before? About building a life together? Or was it just to convince Silas? Tanner took a deep breath. I meant every word. I know it's fast, and I know you have your own feelings to sort through. But Julia. He took her free hand in both of his. I think I've been falling in love with you since the night you showed up at my door. I never thought I'd want a family, but now I can't imagine my life without you and Felicity in it. Tears welled in Julia's eyes. I've been so afraid to admit my feelings. Thomas hasn't been gone a year, and I thought it would be disloyal to care for someone else so soon. She squeezed his hand. But the truth is, I've come to care for you deeply, Tanner. More than I thought possible. Hope bloomed in Tanner's chest. Does that mean you'll marry me? For real, not just to keep Felicity safe? A smile broke through Julia's tears. Yes, I'll marry you, Tanner Blackwood. Tomorrow and for all the days after. Tanner cupped her face gently, mindful of the sleeping baby between them, and lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and full of promise. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, the world around them seemed brighter somehow, more vivid. We should get back to the ranch, Tanner said. We have a wedding to prepare for. Julia nodded, her smile radiant. And a cradle was just the beginning. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the September air crisp with the promise of autumn. At the ranch, Tanner woke early, his mind racing with all that needed to be done. He had spent much of the night in his workshop, completing a project that had been taking shape in his mind for weeks. Julia and Felicity were still asleep when he slipped out to tend to the animals. By the time he returned to the cabin, Julia was up, preparing breakfast with Felicity balanced on her hip. Good morning, she said, a shy smile playing at her lips. Sleep well? Hardly at all, Tanner admitted, crossing to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. Too much thinking. Having second thoughts? There was a hint of vulnerability in her question. Not a chance, Tanner assured her. Just making plans. For our future. They ate breakfast together, the domestic scene so natural it was hard to believe that just months ago, Tanner had been alone in this cabin, convinced he would remain so for the rest of his days. Mrs. Henderson and some of the other women are coming out to help me get ready, Julia told him as they cleared away the dishes. Apparently they've been planning a wedding for us since I first arrived in town. Tanner chuckled. That sounds like Martha Henderson. Never one to miss an opportunity for matchmaking. Julia's expression grew serious. Do you think Silas will really come to the wedding? Probably, Tanner said grimly. But he won't cause trouble, not with the whole town and Sheriff Larson there. And once we're married, his claim on Felicity will be much harder to press. I'm still afraid, Julia admitted. He's not a man who gives up easily. Tanner took her hands in his. Neither am I, and I have a lot more to fight for. The hours passed quickly after that. True to her word, Mrs. Henderson arrived with several women in tow, shooing Tanner out of his own cabin so they could help Julia prepare. He retreated to the barn, where he spent the morning readying the wagon and tending to last-minute details of his surprise. At 11, Sheriff Larson arrived with Reverend Wilson and several of the men from town, including Mr. Henderson and the blacksmith, Harold Parker. Quite the hasty wedding you've arranged, Larson remarked, though his eyes were twinkling. Almost like you had it planned all along. Fate has its own timing, Tanner replied, straightening the clean shirt he'd changed into. Is he in town? Silas. Larson nodded. Checked out of the hotel this morning, but he's still around. Said he wouldn't miss seeing this charade, as he called it. It's no charade, Tanner said firmly. I can see that. Larson clapped him on the shoulder. Never thought I'd see the day Tanner Blackwood took a bride, but I'm happy for you, my friend. She's a fine woman. The finest, Tanner agreed. They set out for town shortly after, Tanner driving the wagon with the men riding alongside. As they approached the small white church at the edge of the settlement, Tanner was surprised to see how many people had gathered. It seemed the entire community had turned out for the occasion. Inside the church, Reverend Wilson took his place at the altar, while Tanner stood nervously at the front, Larson beside him as his impromptu best man. The pews had filled quickly, faces both familiar and less so turning expectantly toward the door. Silas Calloway sat in the back row, his expression cold and watchful, his two companions flanking him like guards. Tanner met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. The church door opened, and Mrs. Henderson entered, carrying Felicity, who was dressed in a new white gown with a tiny crown of wildflowers on her auburn curls. The older woman took a seat in the front pew, settling the baby on her lap. Then came Julia, and Tanner forgot to breathe. She wore a dress of pale blue, simple but elegant, with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was partly up, partly flowing down her back, adorned with the same wildflowers as Felicity's crown. But it was her face that captivated him, radiant with happiness, her green eyes shining as they found his across the small church. Mr. Henderson escorted her down the aisle, having volunteered to give her away. As they reached the altar, he placed Julia's hand in Tanner's, and in that moment, Tanner knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that the woman before him was meant to be his wife, in every sense of the word. Reverend Wilson began the ceremony with a prayer, his voice solemn, yet warm as he spoke of love's endurance through hardship, of God's blessing upon unions formed in mutual respect and affection. Tanner heard the words as if from a distance, his focus entirely on Julia's face, on the feel of her hands in his. Do you, Tanner James Blackwood, take this woman, Julia Marie Calloway, to be your lawfully wedded wife? The Reverend asked. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part. I do, Tanner said, his voice steady and sure. And do you, Julia Marie Calloway, take this man, Tanner James Blackwood, to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part. Julia's eyes never left Tanner's as she answered. I do. The rings, please, Reverend Wilson requested. Tanner reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. He had ridden to the next town the previous evening to purchase it, unwilling to begin their marriage without this symbol of his commitment. With this ring, I thee wed, he said, sliding it onto Julia's finger. When it came time for Julia's part of the exchange, she hesitated, having had no opportunity to obtain a ring for Tanner. But to her surprise, Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, pressing something into her hand, a man's gold wedding band. It was Mr. Henderson's father's. The older woman whispered, We want you to have it. Tears glistened in Julia's eyes as she turned back to Tanner. With this ring, I thee wed, she said, her voice trembling slightly as she placed the ring on his finger. By the authority vested in me, Reverend Wilson pronounced, I now declare you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. He smiled broadly. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Blackwood. Tanner drew Julia gently toward him, one hand cupping her face as he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and profound, a promise, a beginning, a homecoming. The congregation erupted in applause, drowning out whatever comment Silas might have made as he rose abruptly and strode from the church, his companions hurrying after him. The celebration continued at the town hall, hastily decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons by the community women. There was food aplenty, music, and dancing, the atmosphere joyous despite, or perhaps because of the rushed nature of the event. Throughout the afternoon, townspeople approached to offer congratulations and gifts, hand-knitted blankets, preserves, practical items for the household. Tanner was overwhelmed by the generosity of neighbors he had kept at a distance for so long. Sheriff Larson found them as the celebration was winding down. Silas and his men rode out an hour ago, he informed them quietly. Headed east, back toward Cheyenne. Julia sagged against Tanner in relief. Do you think he's given up? For now, at least, Larson replied. I made it clear that any further attempts to separate you from Felicity would be met with the full resistance of the law and this community. His expression softened. You've got a family here now, Mrs. Blackwood. Not just Tanner, but all of us. Tears welled in Julia's eyes. Thank you, Sheriff, for everything. As the sun began to set, Tanner and Julia bid farewell to their guests and headed back to the ranch to their home. Felicity slept peacefully in her mother's arms, exhausted from the day's excitement. When they arrived at the cabin, Tanner helped Julia down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms, Felicity still cradled against her chest. What are you doing? Julia laughed as he carried them toward the door. Carrying my wife and daughter across the threshold, Tanner said, his voice gruff with emotion. Isn't that the tradition? Julia's eyes softened. Yes, it is. Inside, the cabin was transformed. While they had been at the church in celebration, Mrs. Henderson and some of the other women had come out to the ranch. Fresh flowers adorned the table, the bed was made with new linens, and a small feast had been left warming by the fire. But it was what stood in the corner of the main room that brought tears to Julia's eyes. Beside Felicity's cradle was a new piece of furniture, a rocking chair, beautifully crafted from the same pine as the cradle, with intricate carvings along the arms and back. When did you make this? Julia asked in wonder, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Been working on it at night, when you were asleep, Tanner admitted. Finished it early this morning. Thought every mother should have a proper place to rock her baby. Julia carefully placed the sleeping Felicity in her cradle, then turned to Tanner, her eyes shining with love. It's beautiful. Perfect. There's more, Tanner said, taking her hand and leading her to what had been his bedroom, now theirs. The room had been tidied, the bed made up with a colorful quilt that hadn't been there before. But what drew Julia's attention was the small desk beneath the window, atop which sat a sewing machine not new, but well-maintained. Mrs. Peterson mentioned you were skilled with a needle, Tanner explained. Thought you might want to take up some of that mending work she offered. The machine was her daughter's before she moved to California. Julia turned to him, overcome. Tanner, I don't know what to say. You've thought of everything. He took her hands in his. I want you to be happy here. To feel like this is truly your home, not just a place you're staying. It already feels like home, Julia whispered. Because you're here. Tanner drew her close, his arms encircling her waist. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed. A family, a wife. I was so certain I'd be alone. And I never thought I'd find love again, Julia replied, reaching up to touch his face. After Thomas died, I believed that part of my life was over. But then I found you, or rather, collapsed at your doorstep. She smiled at the memory. By morning, you'd built Felicity a cradle. And by doing so, you began building something for all of us. A home, Tanner said. A future. A love, Julia added softly, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. The kiss deepened, passion flaring between them now that they were finally alone, finally free to express the feelings that had been building for weeks. Tanner's hands spanned Julia's waist, drawing her closer, while hers slid up to tangle in his hair. When they finally parted, both were breathless, their eyes dark with desire. I should check on Felicity, Julia said, though she made no move to leave his embrace. "She's sleeping soundly," Tanner murmured, his lips finding the sensitive spot beneath Julia's ear. "And we have all night. All our lives." Julia melted against him, her body fitting perfectly against his. "Yes," she whispered. "All our lives." Later, much later, as moonlight streamed through the cabin window and Julia slept peacefully beside him, Tanner reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. From solitary rancher to husband and father in the span of a few short months. The change should have terrified him, yet instead he felt a profound sense of rightness, of completion. He thought of the cradle he had built that first night, working through the darkness to create something sturdy and safe for a child he hadn't known but had already begun to care for. It seemed a fitting beginning to their story, a story of shelter found, of protection offered, of love taking root in the most unexpected soil. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang its ancient song across the prairie. Inside, in the warmth of their cabin, Tanner Blackwood held his wife close and gave thanks for the storm that had brought her to his door. Epilogue. 5 years later, the summer sun hung low in the western sky, painting the ranch in hues of gold and amber as Tanner rode up to the cabin. The property had expanded considerably in the 5 years since Julia and Felicity had entered his life, a larger main house adjoining the original cabin, a proper barn, expanded corrals, and fields of wheat and corn stretching toward the horizon. As he dismounted, the front door flew open and 2 small figures raced down the steps toward him. "Papa," Felicity called, her auburn hair streaming behind her as she ran. At 5 years old, she was the image of her mother, with the same striking green eyes and determined spirit. "Did you bring it? Did you?" Close on her heels was 3-year-old Thomas, named for Julia's first husband, in a gesture that had moved her to tears when Tanner suggested it. The boy had Tanner's dark hair and sturdy build, but Julia's smile and gentle nature. "Hold your horses, you two," Tanner laughed, scooping Thomas up with one arm while ruffling Felicity's hair with his free hand. "Let a man get inside before you start questioning him." "But you promised," Felicity insisted, dancing around him impatiently. "You promised you'd bring home a surprise." "Did I now?" Tanner pretended to consider this. "I don't recall making any such promise." "You did," Thomas piped up, his small face solemn. "You said so at breakfast." Tanner's face broke into a grin. "Well, if both of you remember it, I suppose it must be true." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I believe I mentioned something about a new book." Felicity's eyes lit up as she accepted the package. "Can we read it tonight?" "All together, if you've finished your chores and had your supper," Tanner agreed. "Now, where's your mother?" "In the garden with baby Francis," Thomas informed him, pointing toward the vegetable plot that Julia had expanded each year since their marriage. Setting Thomas down, Tanner made his way to the garden, where Julia knelt among the bean plants, their youngest child, just 6 months old, sleeping contentedly in a basket beside her. The sight of them still had the power to take his breath away. Julia looked up at his approach, her face breaking into a radiant smile. "You're home early," she said, rising to greet him. Tanner pulled her into his arms, mindful of her soil-covered hands. "Finished at the Parkers sooner than expected." He kissed her softly. "Missed you. It's only been since morning." Julia laughed, but her eyes shone with the same love that had only deepened over their years together. "Too long," Tanner insisted, bending to check on Francis, who slept on, oblivious to his attention. The baby girl had been named for Julia's mother, a connection to a past that was no longer painful, but simply part of the tapestry of their shared history. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by earlier," Julia said as they walked together toward the house, Tanner carrying the sleeping baby while Julia brushed the dirt from her skirts. "She brought a letter from Sheriff Larson." Tanner raised an eyebrow. "Matt? What does he have to say?" "He's getting married," Julia announced with a smile. "To the new schoolteacher, Miss Rebecca Allen. They've invited us to the wedding next month." "About time," Tanner chuckled. "He's been sweet on her since she arrived last fall." Inside the house, Felicity and Thomas were already seated at the table, the new book placed carefully aside as they waited for supper. The scene was so different from the solitary meals Tanner had eaten in this cabin for years, the silence now filled with children's chatter and Julia's gentle presence. After the meal, as promised, they gathered in the sitting room. Julia nursed Francis while Tanner read from the new book. Felicity and Thomas snuggled on either side of him on the sofa. The story was a tale of adventure and discovery, of brave heroes and the meaning of home themes that resonated with their own journey. As the children's eyes began to droop, Tanner closed the book. "I think that's enough for tonight," he said. "Time for little ones to be in bed." There were token protests, but soon enough both Felicity and Thomas were tucked into their beds in the room they shared, with promises of more reading tomorrow. Returning to the sitting room, Tanner found Julia placing Francis in the cradle that still stood in the corner, the same cradle he had built that first night, now lovingly worn from 3 children's use. "She's asleep?" he asked softly, coming to stand behind Julia, his arms encircling her waist. Julia nodded, leaning back against his chest. "Out like a light. She's an easy baby. Takes after her mother," Tanner murmured, pressing a kiss to Julia's temple. "Strong but gentle." Julia turned in his arms, her hands coming to rest against his chest. "I was thinking today about the first time we met. How desperate I was, how frightened. And now," her smile was luminous in the lamplight, "now I can't remember what it feels like to be afraid. Not when I have you. Our children, this home we've built together." Tanner cupped her face in his hands. "Do you ever regret it? Coming west, ending up on my doorstep?" "Never," Julia said firmly. "It was the best collapse I ever had." Tanner laughed softly. "And the best night of building I ever did." They stood together in the warm glow of the lamp, surrounded by the home they had created, not just the physical structure, but the love that filled it, the family that had grown within its walls. From a desperate arrival on a stormy night to this moment of perfect contentment, their journey had been one of courage, trust, and abiding love. Outside, the stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, witnesses to the miracle of 2 souls finding each other against all odds. Inside, in the cabin that had become a home, Tanner and Julia Blackwood held each other close, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the love that had kept them that way. For Tanner, who had once believed himself destined for solitude, and for Julia, who had feared she would never find safety again, their life together was more than either had dared to dream. It had begun with a cradle, built in the dark hours of a desperate night, but it had become so much more a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of second chances, and the enduring miracle of love.